everyone, and welcome to Miss Estruch Biology. And in this video, we're going through the final topic, Topic 7 for AQA GCSE Biology. And I'm going through all of the theory that you need to know. And if you're cramming this last minute before the exam, don't forget you can watch it at ×2 speed to get through even quicker. And if you want to boost your grade even more, then check out my GCSE notes, which are linked in the description below, covering all of the theory for your GCSE, as well as including examiners' tips, topic summaries, key terms, and questions and answers at the end of each chapter. But for now, let's get into the video, and best of luck for your exams, everyone.
So topic 7, we begin by looking at communities, and an ecosystem is made up of all living things or organisms, which are your biotic factors, as well as the non-living parts, which are abiotic factors. These organisms interact with each other and with their surroundings to form a stable system. So a bit more then about these levels of organisation within an ecosystem. We start with the smallest level, which is an individual, so just one living thing. A population consists of multiple individuals, but specifically they're the same species living in one area at the same time. The next level up is a community, and this is made up of the different species that are all living in one shared habitat at the same time. And then the largest level is an ecosystem, which is looking at the interaction of the living and the non-living parts of the environment. And here we can see the increasing levels of organisation when you're considering this in your ecology part of the topic. So in an ecosystem, each species depends on another for survival, which is how we get these concepts of food webs. And this is interdependence. That's a key term that comes up, knowing that the relationship of one species depending on another, they are interdependent. So if we do link that to this concept of food webs, what we mean is if one of these species went extinct, it has a knock-on effect on them all. So let's say the vole went extinct. That would now mean the hawk population is going to decrease because they eat the voles. And the insects here are going to increase because the voles aren't there to eat them anymore. But if the insects increase, that means they're going to be eating more grass. So the grass is going to decrease. That's going to affect the rabbits and so on and so on. So it's looking at how if you just remove one species, because they're all interdependent, it's going to have a knock-on effect. And if you have a stable community, that's one where all species and environmental factors are in balance, meaning population sizes remain fairly constant over time. If we have a look at competition then, which is linked to the idea of biotic factors, because it's two living things competing for limited resources. For example, plants, they compete for light for photosynthesis, water for photosynthesis, they might compete for space, nutrients in the soil as well. Animals can compete for food. If it's the same species, they compete for mates as well. They could compete for territories as well. And species have evolved to have adaptations to help them to survive in their particular environment and be better able to compete as well. And there's 3 types of adaptation: structural, behavioural, or functional. Next then, abiotic factors. These are the non-living parts of an ecosystem. So for example, light intensity, temperature, moisture levels, soil pH, mineral content, wind intensity and direction. And you need to know that these are non-living factors that affect the survival of living things, organisms. And you might have to suggest why. So light intensity links to photosynthesis, temperature links to enzyme-controlled reactions. Moisture levels, water is needed by all living things for different chemical reactions. pH affects enzymes. Mineral content could link to nitrate ions and magnesium ions. And wind intensity could link to either seed dispersal or rates of transpiration. Carbon dioxide levels also impact plants for photosynthesis, and oxygen levels for animals that live in water, because the amount of oxygen dissolved in the water will impact aerobic respiration. Biotic factors, these are the living components of an ecosystem. And when a biotic factor changes, it can have a direct or an indirect impact on a community. So some species numbers might increase if conditions become more favourable, while others may decline if they struggle to compete for resources. So the sorts of things to consider are the availability of food, because food is always a biotic factor, because whether you eat plants or animals, those are living things. New predators arriving can impact whether the prey are going to survive or not. Pathogens as well count as biotic factors, and also the idea of competition. Now, thinking about the idea of competition takes us back to those adaptations that I mentioned. Here are the 3 types of adaptations that plants and animals can have to better survive in their environment. So behavioural, that is how an organism behaves. So it could be desert animals only coming out at night because that's when it's cooler, or it could be penguins huddling to keep themselves warm. Structural are the physical features of an organism that help it to survive. So, for example, thick fur of a polar bear to help to retain the heat. And then functional adaptations are internal processes that allow an organism to function in its environment. So, for example, camels produce really concentrated urine to conserve water. Antarctic fish have antifreeze proteins in their blood to prevent their blood from freezing. There are also some organisms that have adaptations that enable them to survive in extreme environments, and these are known as extremophiles. And one example here is bacteria. There are some bacteria that have adaptations that allow them to be able to survive in really hot vents. So they could be incredibly high temperatures, incredibly high pressure that would kill most other organisms, but they're able to survive there. Next then, let's have a look at food chains and feeding relationships. All food chains start with a producer, which is always a green plant or algae, because they have to be green so that they have chlorophyll and therefore they photosynthesize to create their own food, their own organic molecules, which can be used in respiration. So we have producers at the start. Trophic level is the name of a stage within your food chain or your food web. So producers are always trophic level 1. Next then, everything else in the chain is a consumer, because it means it has to eat or consume to gain its chemical energy. Primary consumer means it's the first organism in the chain that eats. Secondary is the second one, and tertiary is your third one. Now, the primary consumer will always be a herbivore, because that means it must eat plants. Your secondary consumer would be a carnivore because it's eating an animal, and the same thing with your tertiary consumer. And this one's also known as the apex predator because it means it's the last predator in the chain. Apex means at the top. So this is our top predator. Thinking about predators, again, this is an example of your biotic factors, but you get something known as predator-prey graphs or cycles, and this is showing you how the population size of prey and predators fluctuates over time. So we can see here that when the prey population, which is rabbits in this example, increases, there's a bit of a delay, and then we see an increase in the wolf population, and that's because there's now more rabbits for them to eat, so their population can increase. But because the wolf population's increased, that means more rabbits are going to get eaten, so their population decreases. That then means the wolf population will decrease because there's fewer rabbits, and so on and so on. So you see this repeated and predictable pattern that when the prey population increases, predator number also does, and then vice versa, it will then decrease, and it constantly fluctuates like this. Then if we have a look at sampling in ecology, so this is how you can estimate the population sizes. And ecologists can use transects and quadrats to study how species are distributed, so spread out in an area, but also to look at the number of them, which is what we mean by abundance. Now this is one of the required practicals, but we're just sticking to theory in this video, so I'm just going through some of the basics. You'd use a quadrat, which we can see here, which is a frame of a typical size, which is normally 1/2 metre by 1/2 metre. Sometimes they're open, sometimes they have grids in. That helps you to estimate percentage. And you could do random sampling if you've got a uniform area that you're trying to estimate your distribution and abundance. Or you can do transects if you're looking at a change along a particular distance where there might be physical changes that would affect your population. So you'd place just one tape measure, place your quadrat along the tape measure at intervals and record what you have present in those intervals. Now this does link to 3 key math skills that come up with this particular topic. You might have to work out an average number of species, but there's 3 measures of average: mean, median and mode. So here's just a quick recap on what those 3 measurements mean. You could be asked to say what they mean or calculate them. We then look at cycles and we start with the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is really important because it's how carbon, which is a key element found in so many different molecules in all living things, such as carbohydrates, proteins and fats. So knowing how it cycles round is important, so we know how it is constantly able to be used and reused within our ecosystems. So we have photosynthesis is one key stage. That's when plants are going to take in carbon in the form of carbon dioxide and form glucose. The way that carbon gets into animals is that animals are going to be eating the plants. So feeding and digestion is how we get the carbon into the animal. Both plants and animals are going to respire, and that respiration is releasing carbon dioxide. So we then have carbon dioxide going back into the atmosphere. Plants and animals, and also waste from animals, will be decomposed as well. So decay and decomposition is when microbes are going to be breaking down those carbon compounds to release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Combustion is also another way that carbon dioxide is released and it returns the carbon back into the atmosphere. You also need to know about the water cycle, and this provides fresh water for plants and animals and helps to maintain an environment by preventing extreme droughts. So evaporation is how we're going to have liquid water going back into the atmosphere as water vapour, so a gas. Transpiration is how water evaporates out of the stomata of leaves, and again that's returning water to the atmosphere as water vapour. Condensation then is how the water vapour, so it's that gaseous state, is going to be converted back into liquid, which is going to form droplets and therefore the clouds. And precipitation is when those water droplets in the clouds become too heavy and fall as rain, or it could be snow or hail if it's colder. We also have runoff and the infiltration, which is when water is returning to rivers, lakes, underground stores before eventually reaching the oceans as well. And sometimes we can see here that's also known as percolation, when that water is trickling down and goes towards the oceans. Decay links to some of these processes. For example, in the carbon cycle, we said that dead matter and waste can be decomposed and it starts to decay. And this process is done by microorganisms, for example, bacteria and fungi. And they are able to break down those biological molecules to recycle the nutrients. And you need to know the factors affecting how quickly that can happen. So temperature has an impact because decay is done by microorganisms which have enzymes in them. So temperature is going to affect the rate of decay. Water availability has an impact because microorganisms are living things, so they need water for their chemical reactions. And oxygen is also required because microorganisms are living things, they need to respire aerobically as well. So those 3 factors will have an impact on the rate of decay. Decay leads into this idea of biogas production. So biogas is something that gardeners and farmers can actually produce themselves. And they use decay to break down organic waste into compost, which is used as a natural fertiliser. But also by providing the right conditions, you can speed up that decomposition based on what we said in the previous slides. If you want to get your compost, so have a really nutrient-rich soil quicker,
you need to make sure that there's plenty of oxygen, there's moisture available, and it is warm enough. Now, the link here to biogas production is it can use this waste material. However, it's anaerobic decay, which means we don't have any oxygen present. And microorganisms, when you put them in these anaerobic conditions with the waste matter, they will still break it down, but instead of producing carbon dioxide, they produce methane gas. And that is what comes out of your gas taps. So it's a gas that can be burned and used to supply energy. We also need to know about the impact of environmental change, but this is higher tier only. So we've talked about how you could measure the distribution of species in your ecosystem, but you need to know how that distribution can change if the environment changes. And that could mean that some species go extinct in certain areas. And these changes that we see might just be seasonal. They could be in particular locations, so geographical, and sometimes they're also directly caused by human activity. So key environmental factors that affect species distribution are the temperature, availability of water, and also the composition of atmospheric gases. So for example, temperature, that's why some birds will fly south in the winter because it's too cold in the winter in the northern territory, so countries. So instead they fly south so it's warm enough for them to survive. And that links on to these options here. So seasonal changes, as I said, it could be some species will change location depending on the season so that they are able to survive. And that's going to affect the species' global distribution. We also have geographical changes. So natural events such as maybe a volcanic eruption or earthquake or even flooding can alter habitats and force species to relocate. There can also be human-caused changes, so deforestation removes habitats, and that would force species to move, or it could cause them to become endangered and at risk of going extinct in that area. It could also be pollution from industry, plastic waste, or even climate change leading to global temperature rises, affecting species survival and distribution. We then go on to biodiversity, and this refers to the variety of all the different species of organisms on Earth within an ecosystem. Having a high biodiversity is really important to make sure your ecosystem is stable. Because if you've got high biodiversity, that means you've got lots of different species and lots of individuals present of each species. So if one species is affected, so maybe they start to decline in number, then there should be other species that can compensate to prevent a whole ecosystem and food web collapse. So there's different types of things that can reduce biodiversity, starting with pollution. And you need to know about water pollution, air pollution, and land pollution. So if we start with water pollution, this could be untreated sewage going into waterways, fertilizers from farms going into water, toxic chemicals from factories, and even plastic pollution. And if these get into the water system, then they can have big impacts. So strategies to try and prevent that type of water pollution from causing a reduction in species and also individuals surviving are things like making sure that sewage is treated before it's allowed to flow into water, try and getting farmers to reduce the fertilizer use, using renewable energy so we're not having to use as many things in the factories that might produce toxic chemicals, and then recycling and reducing plastic waste are going to help to prevent those microplastics and also larger plastics in the water that can impact plants and also animals. Next on the list, we've got land use. So for land use, humans can reduce the amount of land that was naturally available for wildlife for these 4 key reasons. They might use land for buildings, they might use land for quarrying, they might use land to dump waste, so like landfill, or they might use it for farming. Peat bogs kind of links to this because it's a type of natural habitat linking to the idea of land use, but peat bogs are waterlogged wetlands. So basically really wet and muddy areas, and they store lots of carbon within that waterlogged wetland.
as well as supporting rare species that can only survive in that particular habitat. So the reason these are getting destroyed are peat, which is what we call the mud and the soil found in these waterlogged wetlands, can be removed and dried out, and it's a really fertile compost. It can also be burned and release a lot of energy as a cheap fuel. So that's why they started to get dried out and the soil was removed. However, the issue was you're destroying a really rare habitat supporting these rare species. Because it's burning the contents, you're releasing a lot more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, impacting global warming as well. And they're very slow to regenerate these natural habitats. So the conflict we have here is, yes, it's useful to have higher quality soil so we can grow more crops for higher yields and it supports farmers. But we have to bear in mind that storing these carbon or having these carbon stores is really important because it's going to reduce the rate of climate change and it's protecting rare species. Deforestation then is another part of topic 7. And deforestation is when you have the large scale removal of trees. And we see this a lot at the moment in tropical rainforests because if you clear that land, it can be used for cattle farming or rice fields. It can also be used to grow biofuel crops, which are things like sugarcane. And biofuel was sold as this idea of being carbon neutral, better for the environment than using fossil fuels in your cars. But you've got the issue of you have to cut down a forest to grow it. So is it actually going to be better overall? So why deforestation happens is for economic growth and to provide more food and fuel. But the downside is we get these biodiversity losses. For example, we've seen the mass destruction of the tropical rainforests where orangutans live, just so we have palm oil plantations being able to be grown. So the overall impact is if we have fewer trees, that means we have less carbon dioxide being absorbed for photosynthesis and therefore more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, resulting in more global warming. Also, sometimes when the trees are cut down, they are burned, and that means even more carbon dioxide is being released into the atmosphere as well. And this concept here has come up a few times as a long answer question, knowing both of those reasons, so combustion but also lack of photosynthesis, is why we get more carbon dioxide and therefore it adds to global warming. So a few more impacts as well, just to consider here are, if you're removing forests, trees have roots that are going to be really deep in the soil that help anchor the soil to prevent soil erosion. But also trees are involved in the water cycle because they're absorbing water into them. And if we have fewer trees, then we're going to have less transpiration. And also air pollution is a big impact because we said that they can absorb carbon dioxide. So we always need to be balancing the benefits with considering the long-term effects and coming up with sustainable solutions. So for example, if you cut down a forest in one area, you need to replant it or try and come up with alternative energy sources as well. And we've talked a bit about global warming. You do cover this in physics and a little bit in chemistry as well. But what you need to know is it refers to the gradual increase in the Earth's average temperature due to rising levels of greenhouse gases, which include carbon dioxide and methane, for example. These gases get trapped by the atmosphere and they can absorb infrared radiation. So that means we're trapping the greenhouse gases, those trap the infrared radiation, and it's like we've got this duvet around the Earth heating it up, and that is the greenhouse effect, which is beneficial because it stops the Earth from freezing at night. But if it's happening too much, the Earth's surface temperature is increasing to the point where it could result in species not able to survive anymore. So it's due to this increase in our greenhouse gases from these places. So the biological consequences are you might get a change in species distribution because it might be too hot and dry for them to live in some locations now, so they're going to move further north or further south to the pole. You might get habitat loss and a decrease in biodiversity. More extreme weather events is something that we are seeing a lot of in more recent years. We've seen quite a lot of this in the United States with more extreme weather events. Global warming doesn't just mean the Earth is getting hotter.
We also see that the ocean is becoming more acidic as well because those gases are acidic when they dissolve in water. And all of this has impacts on the food chain as well. So trying to maintain biodiversity, the reason this matters is we want to have stable ecosystems and food chains for all organisms, but also it's vital for human survival as well. The impact that humans are having, though, that is reducing biodiversity, is doing things like deforestation, pollution, impacting climate change, having monocultures, which is when you only grow one species in farming, overfishing, overhunting as well. But there are some positive actions that we see humans putting in place. For example, breeding programs that we see in zoos to try and prevent the extinction of endangered animals. We have habitat protection in national parks and conservation areas, and also trying to regenerate habitats where we have destroyed ecosystems. Maintaining biodiversity does have some challenges though. Although we want to try and do these different things to try and increase biodiversity, so you might want to put hedges in farms because that provides a habitat if you have them in your fields, reduce deforestation and try and recycle more. The conflicting issues are, a lot of these are expensive either for farmers or for the individual. Farmers need land for growing. We need to have housing for humans, but if we're building, then there's going to be deforestation, and also cultural and political global priorities might vary worldwide. If we then go back to the concept of food webs, and we're going to be going into pyramids of biomass, but this is just a recap of what we said earlier. And you might want to just pause and screenshot it so it can go into your notes summarising the trophic levels. But how this links to pyramids of biomass. Biomass, first of all, is the total mass of living material at each trophic level in a food chain. And it represents the amount of energy that's available to individuals in the next level of your food chain. And we can represent it as literally a pyramid diagram. And it is always pyramid shape because the biomass decreases as you move up the food chain. So let's take a look. This here is what we mean by a pyramid of biomass. So it starts widest and it gets narrower and narrower. And every layer of this pyramid is representing the population size of the individuals, so that particular species, in our food chain. So we start with oak trees. They have the biggest biomass. Then we have caterpillars, blue tits and sparrowhawks. And what we mean here is not just how big that organism is. As we said, biomass is the living material at each trophic level. So it's the amount of energy available. So biomass does decrease as you go further up a food chain. And that's because energy is wasted at every stage in the food chain. And in fact, only about 10% of the biomass is passed on each stage. 90% is wasted. And there's different reasons for that. Sometimes it might be that not all of an animal is eaten. So we don't eat fur, shells, bones. So that's wasted biomass. Energy gets lost in respiration. So that then can't be consumed and eaten from the animal because it's already lost. Energy is lost in movement, maintaining body temperature. Energy is lost in feces and urine as well. And we can see here some of the biggest losses for each stage in the trophic levels to help explain the biomass, the pyramid of biomass shape. But also this helps to explain why we don't get food chains that are usually, anyway, longer than 4 trophic levels. Because if we're losing 10% of the energy in the biomass at every stage, by the time we get to the end of the food chain, there's so little energy available, it's actually not worth eating that organism. You're better off going lower down in the food chain. So this is just going into a bit more detail about what we were just saying there about how the energy is lost and why trophic levels are normally only 4 to 5 levels long. So not all parts of the animal are eaten or digested. Energy is lost in respiration and through excretion as well. The next bit is looking at food security. And what this means is having enough food available for all populations. And some of the reasons why countries might not have food security are listed here. And you've got your explanation for each of them as well. So you might want to pause, take a screenshot, you can put that in your notes. So the need for sustainable food production is really important because as the global human population grows and we have increased environmental pressures affecting farming, we must protect food without harming the planet any further. So things like sustainably farming, looking at how we can conserve water when we're farming, so that's our efficient irrigation, growing disease-resistant crops, and coming up with ways to reduce food waste. So in terms of having efficient farming techniques, here are some of the things that could come up. So if you reduce the movement of an animal, they're going to have less energy wasted from movement because they can't move. Whether that's ethical is a different thing, but it is going to be efficient. Temperature control, so keeping animals indoors means that they're going to be warmer and therefore you'll have less energy losses to the environment. Animals are sometimes given high protein diets, so they grow more rapidly. And then these things down here are to do with some of them, plants and animals, but on the whole, these are to do with increasing your plant production. So the pros and cons of these modern farming techniques I've got listed here, as this could come up as a potential 6-mark evaluation question. So you can pause that and take a screenshot. Now, a specific example you need to know is sustainable fishing. And what this means is we are fishing in a way that means we aren't causing all the fish to go extinct and they are able to survive future generations. So we have to prevent the extinction of them. It's important because we don't want animals to go extinct. Also, it means that we are having long-term food supplies, but also jobs for people who do fishing for a living. And it helps to protect the entire marine ecosystem and food webs as well. So if we don't put in actions to make sure fishing is sustainable, then eventually fish stocks will decrease and collapse. That means there will be job losses, there'll be food losses, and will permanently damage the oceans. So here are some ways that fishing can be made more sustainable. So sometimes there are fishing quotas, which means there's a limit on how many fish can be caught. Another one is the size of the net, so bigger holes so that small fish, which are probably younger and haven't reproduced yet, are able to escape and only the bigger ones are caught. There's sometimes bans in particular seasons, which are known to be the breeding seasons, to make sure that there is time for fish to breed so that it'll be replacing the fish that are caught. And also some marine areas are protected and you can't fish in them because that is where fish go to breed. The last bit in topic 7 is the role of biotechnology in food sustainability, but also in agriculture and in medicine. And biotechnology is when we're using biological processes and microorganisms to help. So number 1 is producing mycoprotein, which is a protein-rich meat substitute made from the fungus Fusarium. The brand name is Quorn, so you've probably heard of Quorn. It involves growing large vats of this fungus using glucose as its food source in aerobic conditions. And that's how we then get lots and lots of it being produced and we get corn. So we can see here the optimal growing conditions. We need to have air being bubbled in, so there's oxygen because it's aerobic conditions, the paddles to distribute the oxygen and to make sure the temperature is even because there's enzyme reactions happening, and it'll help to distribute the glucose as well. There's also a water jacket where we have the cool air going around it to make sure it doesn't overheat because that would denature enzymes also. And it needs to be completely sealed and sterile so that we don't have other microbes growing which could contaminate it, which might mean that we produce toxins or they might just outcompete the fungus Fusarium. So the advantage of it is it's a sustainable way to grow food and it's very quick to make. It's actually very low fat and high protein, so it's a healthy alternative to eating meat as well. And it's suitable for vegetarians and vegans. Next option is genetic modification in agriculture. So this is when scientists can alter the DNA of crops to improve certain properties. Golden rice is an example that has happened where rice was genetically modified to contain more vitamin A to try and help prevent blindness. And that's why it looks more golden, because it's that vitamin A. In reality, it didn't actually work very well outside of the lab though, unfortunately.
You can also make drought-resistant crops. They can survive in dry conditions. Insect-resistant crops, so you don't need to use pesticides. So there are lots of advantages, such as higher yields, which means you're going to grow more. So there's more food to get the farmers more money, but also more food for humans. In some cases, better nutrition. We can see here we added in an vitamin. And also disease resistance, so we don't have to use as many chemicals, so pesticides. The concerns, though, are some people worry that because this is still a relatively new technology, we don't know what the long-term effects might be on human health, but also whether it's going to impact ecosystems in the long run. And also, the seeds are very expensive, so poorer farmers aren't able to afford it. The last option is in medicine, and you can use genetically modified bacteria to produce medicines, for example, insulin. And this is an advantage because it's quicker and cheaper to get bacteria to make insulin rather than animals. It's suitable for all diabetics because it means that if you're allergic to the insulin that animals made, you won't be allergic to this because it's actually human insulin. It's just that gene has been genetically engineered to be inside a bacteria. And it can be made in large quantities very, very quickly. So that takes us to the end of topic 7. Pause and test yourself using these questions to check you've understood it. And if you haven't, you can go back over any of these topics. I'm going straight on to the answers now though, so you can mark it when you're ready. So here are the answers. Pause and you can mark your answers. And if you do want more help knowing key terms and even more details, because this video is just surface level detail, whereas my notes go through everything you'll absolutely need to know, as well as having examiner's tips from an actual AQA examiner, key marking points, key summaries, as well as even more questions and answers. The links for those are in the description. But that is it for topic 7. Hopefully you found it helpful, and I'll see you in a video very, very soon.